Hello, hello, welcome back to Loki's Library, and if you are new here, welcome. I am your librarian, Katrina. On Sundays, I do a thing called Books and Booze, where I review a book and mix up a cocktail, or in this case, a mocktail. It is the last Sunday of the month, so we are looking at religion, making this week's book, The Triumph of the Moon, A History of Modern Pagan Witchcraft by Ronald Hutton. It seemed topically appropriate, given that it is October and we are 5 days out from Halloween. Since it is still October and I am still sober for at least the next 5 or 6 days, this week's mocktail is a Blueberry Vanilla Fizz, which I found on this website as a mocktail for a full moon celebration. Blueberry Vanilla Fizz is it's a cup of blueberries, a quarter teaspoon of vanilla extract, and you top it off with club soda. So let's do this. The Triumph of the Moon is written in two parts. Sorry, the first part is the macrocosm, the back part is the microcosm. So the macrocosm, part one, is about the overarching history of how Wicca came to be. The readings and hypotheses and archaeology that led up to this creation of, how many ounces is this? This is a little over a cup by ounces. So macrocosm is about the overarching history of how Wicca came to be, the thought and history that led up to its creation. Hutton looks at approximately 200 years of Western European, primarily English history that influenced the creation of this religion. And yes, he does determine in the end that it's a religion, which I will circle back to. It's supposed to be a quarter teaspoon. That's probably more than a quarter teaspoon, but I also did slightly more than, a cup of blueberries. Hutton looks, first of all, at the literature that had an impact. And I'm not just talking about James Frazer, The Golden Bough, or Robert Graves, The White Goddess, both of which had a heavy impact on the creation of Wicca as a religion. I mean, he does discuss those, but not initially. Initially, he's talking about works by poets and authors like Oscar Wilde, Mary Shelley, yes, and Lord Byron, the Goths, if you will, right, whose literary genius included a bit of the fantastical and don't necessarily reject the concept of God as a deity, but acknowledge that there may be more gods, small g, out there, right? Life truly does imitate art, and once such imagery had entered the artistic sphere, it was not too far off before life started to follow in its footsteps. Let me go ahead and get this blended because it is going to take a minute. All right, so the blending is done. My camera froze. We're going to hope it doesn't freeze again on me. You can strain out the fleshy bits of the blueberries if you want. I'm not going to pour all of this in here because I want to leave room for the fizz. Plus now I have room for extra. Whatever. Oh, that's interesting. I really should have brought a spoon up here. I feel like this should be stirred. Oh, I have a knife. I always have a knife. I'm going to stir this up with my knife. Do note, you should 100% not put club soda in your blender. It will explode because it's carbonated. Carbon is not meant to be shook or blended like that. Yes, my knife is clean. It was hanging on my wall, but I did clean it last week, so it's fine. The blade is very sharp, so I will not be licking the blade clean. Blueberry and club soda. The sort of thing where you could have that as like a smoothie. I mean, I wouldn't put milk in it because if you're going to throw the carbonated, water on, it doesn't need it. But shit, where was I? I don't know when my camera froze. My camera froze while I was blending this. I have no idea if it's going to do it again. We're just going to try and get through this. Now from there, he identifies which goddess, namely Artemis, made the biggest splash in the 19th century and which god, which would be Pan, accompanied her. And all of this is based again on literature that was widely read and widely available in the late 18th and all through the 19th century. And he points out that this revived love for classical ideas of godhood do not in fact make the authors who wrote about them pagan, merely well-read. Big difference. The structure of various magical workings up to and including the Order of the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley's spin-off group Ordo Templi Orientis are discussed. And apparently a good chunk of the initiatory rituals and verbiage are directly cribbed from other mystery cults like the Freemasons, the Order of the Rosicrucians, the Rosy Cross. He lists a half dozen easily different mystery orders, secret orders back of the day, and they all got their spin-off from Freemasons. So the Freemasons started, and then people who didn't advance as fast as they wanted or thought it was too strict would branch out and form their own, or they wanted to be in charge and weren't in charge, so they'd branch out and form their own. And all of that made its way down to the 20th century and would become widely embraced and accepted in Wiccan. Phrases like "so mote it be," and every Wiccan has heard that. How about merry meet and merry part and merry meet again? It's also cribbed from the Freemasons. Hail to the Guardians of the Watchtower. That was fun. That was part of the Freemasons. So the Freemasons conclusively started in 1717. That is the earliest he could trace back any sort of initiatory, continuous anything. And it's not even continuous, right? Because Wicca never even said they came from Freemasonry. He just saw some of these same rituals and were like, this is probably where it came from. All right, it's a pretty big leap to say otherwise. So the Freemasons started in 1717, specifically with the formation of the First Grand Lodge in London, June 24, 1717, according to Wikipedia. Other mystery or secret orders spun out of the Freemasons, which ultimately culminated in the Order of the Golden Dawn, and then its most infamous member, Aleister Crowley. More on him in just a bit. Now, as for the writings of James Frazer, Robert Graves, and Margaret Murray, James Frazer wrote The Golden Bough, Robert Graves wrote The White Goddess. He was also a fiction author. I've read several of Robert Graves' books, but he did not push The White Goddess as fiction. Hey, a blueberry dropped out. Margaret Murray was an Egyptologist, and she was apparently quite good as an Egyptologist. She went off the rails when she wrote The Witch Cult in Western Europe and The God of the Witches in particular, both of which have essentially been thoroughly debunked. Hutton looks at each of these and dismantles them. I mean, not in detail, but he points to other authors who have done so. And basically, these works were populist written, meaning for easy consumption by non-academics, and not researched as serious academic works. Meaning they include nothing that doesn't support their central thesis, which is, there was one great overarching matriarchal goddess, the great goddess who ruled over all of Europe until the evil patriarchy swept in, and yada, yada, yada. I know I've expressed my opinion on that before when I read Terence McKenna, Food of the Gods. I know I decried it in there because I'm like, this is bullshit. I know why I thought that now, because the Triumph of the Moon covers it a little. I've never read Triumph of the Moon before, but he kind of, spells out why I'm like, yeah, this is stupid. Anyways, Hutton then goes into the microcosm. Basically, how did Wicca develop and evolve as a standalone religion from these things? Well, Aleister Crowley keeps coming back to him. Not directly, but he was definitely an ancestor of the craft, as Gerald Gardner, the acknowledged founder of Wicca, 1C, W-I-C-A, mentioned that last week. Gardner did meet and was initiated by Crowley into the Ordo Templi Orientis shortly before Crowley died in 1947. And we know this definitively. It's not just Gardner said so, although he did, but because Crowley was a diligent diarist. He kept a daily journal of everything he did and who he spoke with, and noted in one such having met and initiated Gardner into the Ordo Templi Orientis, OTO. Good news for Gardner. Good news for Gardner, right? He actually can trace his lineage back through Crowley. Bad news for a host of imitators who later all claim to have been initiated by Crowley, probably because the air of legitimacy that such a claim would give them. But none of them were ever actually supported by Crowley's diaries, which, again, he kept detailed journals of everybody he spoke with and who he initiated. So people claiming to have been initiated by Crowley probably can't prove it, because he kept journals and they didn't. And really, if it's not written down, there's no proof it ever happened. Like it's the mid-1950s version of Pixar, it didn't happen. So it was Wicca with one C, which meant wise, and interestingly enough, etymologically interesting. Wicca with one C means wise. And he actually did cover it in last week's book, but I'll go into it now because Hutton spends like a page and a half explaining the etymological breakdown. So, Wicca with one C. I have no idea if it's pronounced with the ch sound, but maybe. Adding the second C changed the definition to literally witch. And Hutton, like I said, page and a half talking about the etymology of the two words, Wicca, W-I-C-C-E versus W-I-C-C-A. Basically, it's a gendered language, witchy with the masculine version, and Wicca being the feminine version of witch. And it should be pronounced like witch, the double C's creating a ch sound. But for whatever reason, probably because Americans are, generally speaking, uncultured swine, we don't have the Latin Greek breakdown in our education, the classical education, like they used to have. It's pronounced Wicca with a hard C now. Now from here, Hutton breaks down the drama and infighting and progression of Wicca as a religion and as a system of magical practice. He does address that, by and large, Wicca is driven these days, at least as of 1999 when this book was first published, by American pagans. That's fair. We tend to take over everything. We're just, we're loud and obnoxious like that. What are you going to do? The ice is making it very, very hard to drink. Should have had a straw. He spends a lot of time in section 2 addressing some of the early and much loved myths regarding the burning times and the witchery, that all witches are descended from one long, unbroken line of women who survived the burning times. But he doesn't do it unkindly, which is more than I would do. I'm kind of mean about these things when people insist on it. He addresses that what cannot be proven or disproven, namely a very long tradition of folk remedies, which in England is generally referred to as a hedge witchcraft. I mean, it was even introduced as such in the late 80s, early 90s. Somebody came out and said this is hedge witchery, right? You're not part of a coven, you're a solo practitioner, and you practice folk remedies. And in America, you'd probably call it an Appalachian magic, Appalachian, or Pennsylvania Dutch is another one I've heard, or even, as Hutton references in the book, Ozark magic, which next year I am absolutely going to read Vance Randolph's Ozark Magic and Folklore, because that book has literally been mentioned in 3 of the books I've read this month. All right. In fact, the last 3 books, it was mentioned in The Black Magic, The High Priest, and now this one have mentioned Vance Randolph's Ozark Magic and Folklore. So I'm like, heck yeah, that must be a great source. I will buy it. They also mentioned The Golden Bough, and now I'm not so excited to read that one because, well, now we know just how much has been disproven. It's like a smoothie without the payoff of the milk that, is just filling you with protein. Anyways. Basically, when he's addressing the lineage of witchcraft, there is absolutely not an unbroken religion going all the way back to ancient Greece. And you would actually be hard-pressed to find anyone who practices Wicca who thinks there was. But most will acknowledge that on the stage of world religion, they are well aware that their faith is an infant, right? It's 70 years old, came about in the 1950s with Gerald Gardner. And comparatively speaking, this is a baby religion. However, it is not impossible that the folk remedies you learn from your grandmother or great-grandmother comes from an older tradition that was handed down for a long period of time, that 500 years ago might have been considered witchcraft. And you can't disprove an oral tradition, but you also can't prove it, and that's the problem, right? That's why that was the biggest problem with the Golden Bough and the god of the witches and the white goddess and all of that, is they're making these huge leaps of faith based on the tiny little Venus of Willendorf figurine, which was really only found in one very specific area in Eastern Europe, and then they're extrapolating it out saying this was the goddess they all worshipped all across Europe, and there's not one shred of evidence to back that claim up. And he says that much. I mean, I'm being very pithy with it, but he goes into greater detail on that and covers other books that cover it in even greater detail than his. Hutton does ultimately come down on the side of this is a religion. It's a small infant religion that is largely unstudied by academics. He has exactly one other compatriot who has written an academic book on this subject. I don't remember her name, but it's in here. Like multiple times. Like, he read her work extensively and drew on that for some areas of research for him to do. He addresses some of the myths around it, like skyclad, which means naked, right? Naked ceremonies, like people seem to think that they devolve into orgies. He hypothesizes that the reason for nudity is twofold. One, to get your headspace right for performing magic. I mean, if you're naked, you're aware that this is not normal, and so you're focused on the ceremony. Probably focused on not staring at your neighbors, too. 2, group nudity is an open statement of trust in your fellow coven members, because you have to trust them to be that vulnerable around them. And make no mistake, nudity is vulnerable, right? You are bearing it all literally for everybody around you to see. It's a vulnerable state to be in. Might also explain why I am not in a coven. I don't think I trust anyone outside of my husband well enough to be naked in front of them. Throwing some more soda water in there to loosen this up because it is a very thick shake. Calling it a shake, it's not a shake, but it's very thick. Basically just ground up blueberries. It's exactly what it is. It's not just basically, it is literally ground up blueberries. Orgies are actually a no-go, partly because to enforce an orgy is to enforce a rape culture, which is very, very frowned upon in a feminist religion, right? It should always be willingly. Generally speaking, sex may or may not happen between the high priestess and the high priest, but usually only if they're already a couple. It's not an expected thing. Any alcohol served is strictly for ceremonial purposes. Think of wine during the Catholic Mass, right? This is the blood of Christ. You don't drink the whole bottle. You have a small sip for ceremonial purposes. It's very similar here with the cakes and the wine. Being drunk is sort of contraindicated and can fuck up the power being drawn into the circle being cast. So he covers all these, and of course covers ad nauseum that this is not Satanism. This is a standalone religion. You actually have to believe in Satan to be a Satanist, and witches generally don't. While there are a steadily growing number of solo practitioners, part of that is because coven membership is harder to come by. Because this is a fully participatory religion. There are no passive observers. This isn't going to mass or a mega church and listening to somebody preach and then maybe saying hallelujah every now and then. If you go to a Wicca ceremony, you are going to participate in some way. And it's not going to just be amen, pass the bread. It's going to be something. You'll have a line to say, cast part of the circle, call one of the guardians. You'll do something. You will be a part of the ceremony, all right? It pulls you in and makes you part of it. There are no passive observers, which means of necessity, coven membership is limited to around 13. Now, last week's book, the author didn't know why, since Gardnerian tradition required male-female pairs, and 13 is an odd number. My thought last week was, it's 6 couples with a high priestess, most likely postmenopausal, to lead the coven. Now, that was my thought last week. Hutton points out in his final chapter, where he addresses some of the demographics, postmenopausal is not the typical age range of a practicing Wiccan, at least not in a coven. So I kind of have no more answers than Jason Mankey did on that number 13. I doubt it has anything to do with superstition. Would now guess this to keep the number of participants to an easily managed range. The book was largely interesting. There were some parts I kind of glossed over, mostly because I didn't see the relevance. So, for example, he'd be talking about one person's books and what they wrote, and then mention they were staunchly anti-communist or pro-socialist or, happy, loved capitalism, whatever. And I could not see what the hell that had to do with the topic at hand. So I'd kind of skim over it until he pulled the book back into focus with something that did seem relevant to the topic at hand. It is, however, very much intended as a scholarly work. It's intended for academics, which is not to say it's unreadable if you are not an academic. You can read it, but it's densely written. It's only 416 pages, and I thought, oh, no problem, I'll read that easy peasy. It's only like 50 pages a day, right? Then I opened it up, and I saw the 8-point font, and I thought, this is it. This is the book I go blind reading. And overall, it was not too bad, though. I do feel it probably could have cut about 50 pages of exposition, then, blown the font up to at least 10 point and still had it come out around 400 pages. I seriously don't care what somebody's political beliefs are in context of what he, she said, wrote, or said. It's just 90 years ago, right? Those lines have blurred and shifted significantly in the intervening century and no longer have relevance, all right? Whether somebody was pro or anti-capital, communist, social, whatever, it's just not relevant to this particular topic. He even says in here somewhere that there is literally nothing about this religion that says you can't be a conservative. I'm actually using that quote for my blog post today because I thought that will tweak some noses. We're going to throw that out there. Except for Andrea Dworkin. No joke, she makes an appearance in this book, which shocked me. It did. When he did the chapter on American contributions, it surprised me because I never think of her in context of possible witchiness. She does not hit witch vibes for me. Unless it's, as just a screaming, she would have been called the witch back then, but today she'd just be called a Karen, I think. I think of her as a batshit insane feminist who directly contributed to the mad clusterfuckery of political discourse in the 80s and 90s, and the 2000s, because she just, oh my God. I mean, fortunately, whatever feminist ramblings she contributed to the witchcraft conversation have largely been debunked. Dworkin was a large, pun not intended, I will throw a picture up here so we can all mock her together, proponent of it was men who burned women and it was a gynocide. It was the intentional dismantling of the matriarchy because the patriarchy sucks. And that is not at all true. Hutton said, and this was such an outstanding paragraph outlining why the myth of the burning times needs to die, right? Quote, the traditional paradigm of witch trials as a means by which people in power regulated and indoctrinated their inferiors, which flourished from the 18th century to the 1970s, has collapsed almost completely. It is now obvious that the main force in driving on persecution was pressure from common people, who genuinely feared and hated witches, and wanted their rulers to act against them in times of social upheaval and economic crisis. The greatest single factor in keeping trials relatively infrequent was the disinclination of those rulers to oblige, so that hunts flourished not where states were larger and more powerful, but where they were smaller and most fragmented. Basically, the decentralized nature of governments is what would cause witch trials to flare up, not the patriarchy. One thing I do disagree with Hutton on, though, is that Wicca, he says like Wicca is the first religion to combine magic with the religious practice. So and I disagree with that. I don't disagree that Wicca combines religion and magic. I think obviously that's one of their central tenets, right? I disagree that it's the first. Because like what else would you call when you go into a Catholic church and you light a votive candle other than it's magic? You're lighting a spark and praying that a divinity sees that spark and chooses to act on it. And I fail to see how that is any different from Wicca. You go to a Wiccan ceremony, you're participating in the ceremony, you're lighting a spark and praying the divinity listens. And that's it for this week. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you guys next Sunday. Bye.